Welcome to Lesson 2 of our Reform unit. Remember that Reform happened between 1820 and 1850, and that the Second Great Awakening was a Protestant religious revival movement characterized by enthusiasm and emotion. The Second Great Awakening stimulated the establishment of many reform movements, including abolitionism, temperance, and women's suffrage. Let's take a look. Temperance reform centered around the outlawing of alcohol. Organizations such as the American Temperance Society and Daughters of Temperance worked at trying to stop the consumption of alcohol. Temperance groups spread the word about the dangers of alcohol. Many people believed that the consumption of alcohol led to addiction, poor health, being poor, and family problems, and alcohol use was high among factory workers. Let's talk about abolition. The overarching goals of the abolitionist movement included immediate emancipation or freeing and political, economic, and social equality for Blacks. From 1700s to 1804, religious leaders, especially Quaker leaders, used sermons to change public opinion about slavery. By 1804, all states north of Pennsylvania had outlawed the practice of slavery. In 1807, Congress banned the importation of African people into the United States. And in 1817, the American Colonization Society was created to help create good conditions for people who were freed. Abolitionist groups worked mostly in the North to end slavery. A man named William Lloyd Garrison creates his own anti-slavery newspaper called The Liberator. And a man that you'll need to know for your test, Frederick Douglass, is an escaped slave from Maryland who published an anti-slavery newspaper, The North Star. We also need to talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's a book by Harriet Beecher Stowe that was widely popular. It was a bestseller, and it furthered the cause of abolition in the North. Uncle Tom's Cabin brings attention to just how evil slavery is. We also need to talk about Sojourner Truth. She was a former slave who made it her life's goal to travel and tell people the truth about slavery. We also need to talk about women in the 1800s, something that Sojourner Truth actually helped to advocate for as well. In the 1800s, women were not seen the same way and were treated differently than men. Women were expected to stay at home and not work, were not allowed to serve on juries, and could not vote. During this time, the most important role of a woman was to raise children. Susan B. Anthony worked to change that. The women's rights movement convened at Seneca Falls, New York, to advocate for women's rights. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott were leaders in reform movements for abolition and suffrage, the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony was a key spokesperson for the 19th century women's suffrage movement. Stanton and Mott were leaders of the 19th century women's suffrage movement. She called for the first convention of the women's rights movement in Seneca Falls and wrote the Declaration of Sentiments, which was approved at the Seneca Falls Convention. However, it was not until the 1920 that the 19th Amendment was ratified, giving women the right to vote. So again, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the Seneca Falls Convention. It's the first big meeting for women's rights. At the meeting, they write the Declaration of Sentiments, which asks for women to be treated the same as men and have the right to vote. She borrows language when she writes this from the Declaration of Independence and says that all men and women should be created equal. Let's sum up what we've learned today. We talked about the temperance movement, which had the goal of banning alcohol. We talked about abolition, the movement to end slavery, and how Frederick Douglass wrote a newspaper called The Liberator. And we talked about the fight for women's rights, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. That's it for today. Have a great day.